May 5, 1945. The war in Europe was drawing its last, desperate breaths in the serene, green heart of Upper Austria. The U.S. 11th Armored Division advanced cautiously through the scenic Danube Valley, their tanks rumbling over hills that had witnessed centuries of peace and recent years of horror. By then, everyone thought the conflict was almost over. The soldiers expected quiet towns and surrendered flags. They did not expect what they saw as they crested a rise near the town of Mauthausen, a fortress looming on the horizon, its massive stone walls and looming guard towers casting long, sinister shadows. To the men, it looked like something torn from the age of knights and monsters, an impenetrable castle built for giants. But as their tanks edged closer, another sense overtook them, a stench that cut through the crisp spring air. The sharp, unforgettable odor of rotting flesh, smoke, and burning bodies. The men exchanged glances, their nerves tightening. Orders were barked. The tanks accelerated, smashing through the iron gates. What greeted them inside was worse than any nightmare they'd prepared for. It was worse than Dachau. Worse than Buchenwald. The men realized, with growing dread, that this was no ordinary prison. This was Mauthausen. The Nazis themselves called it the murder house, a place where those considered irredeemable enemies of the Third Reich were not just imprisoned, they were worked to death. The Americans climbed the walls to see for themselves. From above, the camp revealed its true horror, a colossal granite quarry, a pit carved deep into the earth, lined with jagged stones. Leading out of the pit were 186 steep, uneven steps, the infamous stairs of death. At the bottom of the stairs, motionless forms lay in tangled heaps, bodies, broken and discarded, evidence of the relentless cruelty that ruled this place. Here, the rules of war and humanity had been warped into something monstrous, but on May 5th, everything changed. The prisoners, sick, starving, yet suddenly full of desperate hope, were free. The SS guards tried to flee, but their own fear slowed them down. The prisoners, driven by a mixture of vengeance and survival, caught up with them, dragging them to the top of the cliff that had claimed so many lives. The tables had turned. The hunted had become the hunters. The former victims gave the tormentors a taste of their own medicine. This is the true story of Mauthausen, the most brutal labor camp in history, and of the chilling revenge the survivors exacted on the men who had tortured them for years. But to understand what happened that day, you must first understand what these prisoners endured. The story of the murder house is one of unimaginable suffering, but also one of retribution that shocked even the battle-hardened soldiers. Was not just a camp, it was a monument to cruelty, engineered atop a vast granite quarry. Hitler's vision for the Third Reich demanded stone for monuments and cityscapes, and Mauthausen's prisoners were then willing laborers expected to pay with their lives. The man overseeing all of this was Franz Ries, the camp's SS commander, infamous for his sadism. His philosophy was chilling in its simplicity. There are no sick here, only the living and the dead. Each day began before dawn. Prisoners, reduced to skeletons wrapped in filthy striped uniforms, were forced into a merciless routine. 12 hours of backbreaking labor, in freezing snow or blistering heat, awaited them. Their task: to carry massive blocks of granite, some over 100 pounds, heavier than many of the men themselves, up the 186 slippery, uneven stairs of death. Imagine a starving man, barely 90 pounds, barefoot and frail, forced to lift a stone heavier than his own body. Step by punishing step, up the treacherous stairs he would go. If he stumbled, he died. If he dropped the stone, he died. If he faltered, he risked triggering a human avalanche, bodies tumbling down, shattering against the stone. The SS guards turned this torment into entertainment. They laughed, jeered, and struck the prisoners with clubs, making a spectacle of suffering. But the stairs were only part of the horror. At the lip of the quarry was a 160-foot drop onto jagged rocks. Here, the SS devised their cruelest game, the parachute jump. They would drag a trembling, exhausted prisoner to the edge, gun pressed to his back. "Jump, parachutist," the guard would sneer. If the prisoner hesitated, he was shoved. His scream would echo off the stone, ending in a sickening thud. Those still working below had no time to mourn. They'd be forced to load the broken bodies onto carts alongside the granite. Sometimes, prisoners were made to push each other over the edge. Refusal meant both would plummet. The horror became routine, a daily ritual that painted the cliff wall with blood. For 7 relentless years, this cycle of terror continued. Hope was a dangerous thing. Often, it was the first thing to die. As the Allies advanced in the spring of 1945, Mauthausen's commandant knew the end was near. Zuries ordered desperate measures to destroy evidence, dismantle gas chambers, move prisoners on death marches. But the Allied tanks were closing in fast. Into this chaos rode Staff Sergeant Albert J. Kiek and his 23-man reconnaissance platoon, scouting ahead in their M8 Greyhound armored cars. They had no idea what awaited them. Then, fate intervened. A lone figure appeared on a bicycle. Louis Hafliger, a Swiss Red Cross delegate. Risking everything, he flagged down the Americans with a frantic warning. The SS planned to blow up 40,000 prisoners, hidden in tunnels. Kiek hesitated. He was outnumbered and deep behind enemy lines, but looking at his men, he made the call. "Let's go." The armored cars roared toward Mauthausen. The SS, seeing the white stars of the American vehicles, panicked. Some guards dropped their weapons and fled into the woods. Others tried to fight, but the Americans' .50 caliber machine guns ripped through the guard towers and defenses. Within minutes, the resistance collapsed, and the gates were breached. Inside, thousands of prisoners, living skeletons in tattered rags, poured out of the barracks, weeping with relief, overwhelming their liberators. But beneath the celebration, an undercurrent of something darker was rising. The mood was shifting. The nightmare wasn't over. It was about to change shape. The prisoners, the gates of once powerless, fell and the camp was flooded with American soldiers. The air was electric with disbelief and wild hope. Emaciated prisoners, wrapped in filthy stripes, surged from the barracks. Some fell to their knees, sobbing and kissing the muddy boots of the liberators. Others reached out with trembling hands, desperate for water, food, or simply the confirmation that this horror was ending. For a moment, it felt as if the world had tilted back toward justice. But liberation did not instantly heal years of agony and humiliation. In the shadow of the guard towers, a new energy pulsed through the crowd. Rage, not only at the guards but at the years lost, the pain endured, the friends and family murdered. The Americans, overwhelmed by the scale of the suffering, began tending to the sick and dying. They tried to restore order, providing food, water, and basic care. But their presence was not enough to contain what was about to happen. As the chaos of liberation unfolded, some SS guards who had failed to escape tried to blend in with the prisoners, swapping uniforms, hiding in cellars, or cowering behind piles of rubble. But revenge had a long memory. The survivors recognized their tormentors, the block leaders, the men who had pushed brothers from the cliff, the monsters who had laughed at their pain. Word spread like wildfire. Hunting parties formed, armed with whatever came to hand: shovels, stones, lengths of pipe, and even firearms dropped by fleeing Germans. There were no trials, no calls for justice, only the primal urge for vengeance. Prisoners dragged guards from hiding places, potato cellars, storage rooms, even from among the sick. Some SS men pleaded, "I was only following orders," but their words were drowned by the roar of the mob. The prisoners beat the guards with their fists, clubs, and rocks. Some they tore apart in blind fury, others they executed. Quickly, the American officers tried to intervene, shouting, "Stop! They must be prisoners," but the answer was cold and direct. A Russian prisoner, pointing to the smoking chimney, replied, "They did not stop for us. We will not stop for them." Faced with the truth of what these men had endured, the Americans stepped back. Deep down, many did not want to interfere. There are moments in history when the rules collapse, when rage and retribution seem not only inevitable, but justified. Yet the greatest revenge was reserved for the very steps that had broken so many. A group of prisoners seized a handful of SS guardsmen notorious for their cruelty on the stairs of death. The prisoners forced the guards to pick up the same massive granite blocks they themselves had carried, ordering up. "Now you climb." The SS men, trembling, struggled to lift the stones, their fear obvious even in the Spring sunlight. Like so many before them, they staggered up the 186 steps. Prisoners followed, jeering, hicking, striking the guards when they faltered. At the top, the prisoners dragged the SS to the cliff. The parachutists wall. There was no mercy, no pause for pity or reflection. They pushed the guards over the edge, one after another. Screams echoed, fading into the darkness below. The bodies landed atop the bones of their own victims, the grim and terrible symmetry. The American soldiers watched from the distance, silent, making no move to intervene. They understood this was not random violence, as the dust settled over Mauthausen. In that final chapter of this nightmare, justice and vengeance became indistinguishable. The commandant of the murder house had vanished as the Americans advanced. He believed he could outpace justice, hiding in a remote hunting cabin nestled deep in the Austrian mountains. But the net was closing. On May 23, 1945, American soldiers tracked him down. Zuris tried to run, desperate and wild, but gunshots rang out, echoing through the trees. He fell, wounded, and was dragged back to the camp he once ruled with an iron fist. This time, the tables were truly turned. Zuris was not treated as a prisoner, nor as a patient. He became an exhibit, a symbol of evil undone. The survivors, former prisoners who had cowered at his orders, now stood around his hospital bed. They stared at the wasted, dying man in his filthy uniform, the god of their torment reduced to a trembling shadow. Over hours, he broke under questioning, confessing to his crimes, the gassing of 65,000 souls, the creation of hideous trophies from human skin. There was no redemption. When death finally claimed him, his body did not receive the dignity of burial. Instead, the prisoners carved a swastika into his chest and hung him from the camp fence like a grotesque scarecrow. For days, the survivors spat at the corpse as they passed in and spoke in final judgment on a man who had did not end with untouchable. The town of Mauthausen itself, just down the road, could no longer plead ignorance. Civilians insisted, "We saw nothing. We heard nothing," but the Americans were not deceived. The wind had carried the smoke, the smell, the truth into every home. Now, the liberators forced the townspeople to confront the horror they had ignored. Men and women, their faces pale with shock and disgust, were made to march into the camp. They dug mass graves, cleaned the filth from the barracks, and faced the stares of death that had claimed so many. Some retched, some wept, but all were watched by American rifles. No one could turn away from the truth any longer. The liberation of Mauthausen was not a story of simple triumph. No one emerged unscarred. The survivors were too shattered to cheer. The soldiers, hardened by war, were left haunted by what they had witnessed. But what happened on those infamous steps, a moment when the powerless seized justice for themselves, remains one of history's most chilling reversals. There were no courtrooms, no lawyers, no appeals. The victims became the judges. The instruments of their torment became the instruments of retribution. Was it legal? No. Was it moral? Perhaps not. But was it understandable? Absolutely. Sometimes, when humanity has stared into the abyss for too long, it finds the strength to push the monster in. The Americans, standing silent as the guards fell, seemed to understand that some verdicts are written in suffering, not in law, and so the story of Mauthausen ended, not with celebration, but with the grim satisfaction that the scales of justice, however briefly, had balanced. The world moved on, but the memory of the stairs, the quarry, and the final reckoning would never fade.